From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
The Kluge Staff Fellow was made possible by the generosity of the late John W. Kluge. And Dr. Susan Garfinkel has been a beneficiary this year of the fellowship. She earned not only her BA, but also her MA, which was in folklore and folklife, and her PhD in American civilization from the University of Pennsylvania. Her thesis examined the meanings of the Meetinghouse for Philadelphia's Quakers between 1755 and 1830. Dr. Garfinkel also holds a second MA through the University of Delaware's program with the Winterthur Museum, which is considered the premier museum of American decorative arts. Since 1997, she has been an affiliate associate professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland in College Park. And in 2002, she became a staff member of the Library of Congress, working as a research specialist with the Digital Reference Section. Her area of concentration is early American history and culture, and she is the designated specialist for the richly used online database known as the Historic American Building Survey. In addition to handling thousands of reference questions, Susan, along with her other colleagues on the digital reference team, create ongoing workshops and video conferences for K through 12 teachers and librarians from all over the United States. Dr. Garfinkel's written work appears in, for example, Quaker Aesthetics, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, Women and Health in America from the University of Wisconsin Press, the Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World from Cambridge University Press. Her articles Vernacular and Folklore, Folklife, the latter written with her LC colleague, Jaretta Heckscher, appeared in Material Culture in America. The Kluge Staff Fellowship has provided Susan 1 year to do research into the collections of the Library of Congress. That research was for her in-progress book manuscript entitled, like today's talk, This Separation Forced Upon Us, Philadelphia's Free Quakers and the Culture of Revolution. Please help me welcome her, Dr. Susan Garfinkel.
Before I start the content of my talk, I'd like to, as almost every Kluge fellow of any sort I've seen stand up here, thank a number of people, starting with all the librarians, archivists, and subject specialists here at the Library of Congress and at Philadelphia institutions who assisted me in my research this year, and the staff of the Kluge Center, my colleagues at the Digital Reference Section who held down the fort while I was away, my family and friends who tolerated my odd historical obsessions, and especially whoever it was, perhaps Mr. Kluge himself, who thought to give a staff member at the library such a wonderful research opportunity as I've had this year. Someone recently asked me if I had accomplished everything I wanted to during this past year of research. My answer was that I had started to accomplish everything, but that inevitably I encountered more information and more twists and turns in the historical evidence than I could possibly have planned for. So what I present to you today is very much a work in progress, based especially in a protracted phase of letting the research take me where it would. I invite your thoughts and questions as I continue to strive to make sense of it all. And since this is a work in progress, and since my primary task during my fellowship year has been research and exploration, I thought that what I do in my time today is show you some of the things that I found and some of the ways that I've been thinking about them in my research. My background, as Mary Lou mentioned, is in the interdisciplinary field of American studies, so that my take on the study of history is heavily influenced by anthropology and folklore. What this means is that I'm interested in culture as much as in events, and by culture I mean something that is broad and inclusive, a community's or a society's shared ways of being in the world. History's events always take place against a background of beliefs, practices, and expressions, places, forms, and environments, social structures, organizations, and institutions. So I've grouped my exploration of Philadelphia's Free Quakers and their cultural legacy into three initial categories, which I've called inscriptions, narratives, and convergences, which additively build upon each other. Then, with a background of context and examples shared between us, in my remaining time, I'll talk about the specific instance of the site with important meanings for the group, the Free Quaker Meetinghouse of 1783. But first, let me set the scene. And in fact, before I do that, just a quick note on terminology. The Society of Friends is the official name of the religious group we more often refer to as Quakers, who were also sometimes just called Friends with a capital F. I use the terms interchangeably, as did Quakers of the Revolutionary era. Note, too, that Quaker meetings are designated by location and frequency. Philadelphia monthly meeting, for example, and they are hierarchically arranged. I have told you before of the apprehension I had of a providential design in rending this empire. So wrote the soon-to-be disowned Samuel Wetherill Jr. in a voluminous letter to 6 weighty members of the Philadelphia monthly meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. Writing in 1778 at the height of the American Revolution, Wetherill carefully detailed for them his justifications for taking the test of allegiance to the states, required by Pennsylvania law, but forbidden to Quakers on pain of disownment. His offenses included not only taking the test, but also publishing or distributing a book that promoted dissension among friends, most likely Isaac Gray's pamphlet, A Serious Address to Such of the People Called Quakers on the Continent of North America as Profess Scruples Relative to the Present Government. While noting that, quote, not anything I say can prevent a determination against me, still Wetherill penned over 20 densely reasoned pages rehearsing his actions, his beliefs, and the tenor of complicated times. Notably, while Wetherill complied with Pennsylvania's June 1777 call for individual affidavits of allegiance, he did not take an oath. Instead, as the surviving certificate here at the Library of Congress attests, which you see on your screen, Wetherill opted for an affirmation of allegiance, that alternative to swearing provided for Pennsylvanians such as Quakers whose religious sensibilities prevented the taking of oaths. It is ironic and instructive that both Pennsylvania's newly radical legislature and Samuel Wetherill, himself a recognized minister among Friends, would so carefully uphold this peculiar practice of Quaker affirmation while so blatantly violating the more immediate directives of Friends against supporting the revolution in any way. Some 3 months earlier, Wetherill's brother-in-law, Timothy Matlack, also a disowned Quaker, had similarly affirmed his acceptance of office as secretary to Revolutionary Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council. When under Wetherill's leadership as clerk, a small number of disowned Friends came together in February 1781 to form a group that they called the Society of Friends, known by some as the Free Quakers. They were motivated by the genuine desire for shared religious communion along the fundamental principles of Friends, but also by their shared support of independence. Considering themselves wrongfully disowned, in a series of published broadsides, the Free Quakers reiterated their religious convictions, defended their support of the revolution, advertised for members, and codified the rules of a Quaker-style discipline. This separation, they wrote, has not been sought by but forced upon us. And there appears no reasonable ground of expectation that we shall ever again be united with those who have disowned us, for they will not permit among them that Christian liberty of sentiment and conduct which all are entitled to enjoy and which we cannot consent to part with. We wish only to be freed from every species of ecclesiastical tyranny. To answer the problem of both social and societal circumstances changing beyond their control, Wetherill and company publicly invited their fellow sufferers to, quote, partake with us as brethren indeed united in affliction. A second broadside amplified the message, quote, separated and scattered abroad as if we had been aliens in a strange land, the prospect of our situation has indeed humbled us. Taken together, these public testimonies demonstrate the desire of Free Quaker members to continue the spiritual fellowship from which they had been painfully removed, yet they also define a thoroughly new approach to achieving such ends. The Free Quaker request for use of friends' property for their worship was unprecedented and was quickly denied by the Standing Society of Friends. Next came a truly remarkable step. Early in 1782, the Free Quakers brought their case publicly to the Pennsylvania Assembly. Stressing their revolutionary credentials as well as their property rights, the Free Quakers asked not only for legislated access to existing Friends' meeting houses, but for a ruling against the practice of Quaker disownment itself. When in time this appeal also failed, the Free Quakers raised funds by subscription to build a meeting house of their own. Completed in 1784 and now part of Independence National Park, the small but prominent structure stands as a witness to religious and ideological dissent at a moment of profound change in Philadelphia's and the nation's cultural development, and as the oldest Quaker meeting house surviving within Philadelphia's original city limits. Carved in the date stone on the eastern gable end is a striking inscription. By general subscription for the Free Quakers, erected in the year of our Lord 1783 of the Empire 8. The empire referenced here is, of course, the newly established American one, which by starting on July 4th of 1776 makes for some odd-looking math on the date stone. Sorry, I meant to leave that on the previous, going the wrong direction here. Back is not an option. I am so sorry. Don't know how to go back. There we go. Sorry about that. Meant to leave it here. In his popular 2007 book, How the Quakers Invented America, author David Yount writes that it is no coincidence that the American Declaration of Independence was proclaimed in Quaker, Pennsylvania, citing a variety of Quakerly influences on America's emerging national character as well as its political organization. If Quakers did not quite invent America, he asserts, they contributed more than any other group to the founding ideals that sustained our national life. While I won't directly take on the merits of his assertions in my talk today, I do find the boldness of his statements intriguing in this context. Consider that only a small number of the Quakers disowned for supporting the revolution went on to become Free Quaker members. Despite this, scholars have tended to discount the Free Quakers' collective religious convictions, seeing their movement as poorly masked politics or even as simply vindictive. I argue instead that belief is central to understanding the Free Quakers and that no sharp separation can be made between political belief and religious belief, and none can validly be drawn. It can, however, be negotiated. It is somewhere in that Free Quaker moment of decision to move forward with public legal action against Friends that my ongoing fascination with this story resides. Once we accept the premise that Free Quaker members acted in good faith on the basis of strongly held beliefs, we next need to ask of ourselves what allowed them to collectively reimagine Quakerism while still viewing themselves as directly and perhaps more correctly within the actual Quaker tradition. From what I can tell, it was everything else in their world that compelled them, just a bit of which I'll have time to talk about today. So then, I start with Inscriptions. Let me frame the rest of my talk today with these two artifacts that we've already seen, Wetherill's Certificate of Allegiance and the Free Quaker Date Stone, which are in some ways very different, but in others quite the same. One is a small slip of paper bearing a printed message with the blanks filled in by hand. The other, a massive stone that has been dressed, carved, and prominently mounted in the gable end of a newly built house of worship. One, though governmental, is for individual, if not exactly private use. The other, almost entirely for public display. Yet whether printed on paper or carved in stone, each is an inscription, an epigraph, patterned so as to authenticate and to commemorate a specific, significant moment when a person or group of people took action of consequence. See them as historical markers, if you will, but markers produced in their own time and place. For me, such artifacts are fundamental building blocks of cultural history because of the way they juxtapose event and idea. As inscriptions, they are the surviving evidence of past experience embedded alongside all the richness of their original cultural context. To the Free Quaker story, I could and will add other telling inscriptions, chief among them a certificate showing that in December of 1775, Samuel Wetherill Jr. subscribed at least a full 10 pounds towards the joint stock of the United Company of Philadelphia for promoting American manufactures, signed incidentally by another Free Quaker, Joseph Stiles, a group whose plan was to begin with the manufacturing of woolens, cottons, and linens and carry on the same to the greatest extent and advantage our stock will admit of. Prior to joining the manufactory, as it was known, Wetherill had been trained as a house carpenter and worked to survey houses for Philadelphia's first fire insurance company. Now, as one of the manufactory's 12 managers, he was centrally involved in the day-to-day operations of the textile factory they had successfully created. Soon, he would go into business of his own, and for the textile factory for which this is his trade card, he, in 1775, provided cloth to Washington's army at Valley Forge. This manufacturing emphasis would set the direction for the rest of Wetherill's prosperous career. An interest in dyes and textiles evolved by the 1790s into America's first successful white paint factory, shown here as continued by his sons in 1831. Scholars have noted that participation in the manufactory opened the door to political leadership for several of Philadelphia's artisan class revolutionary leaders, most notably James Cannon and Christopher Marshall. While Wetherill was not overtly political in this period, other Free Quakers were, and we will see how the politics of the period centrally affected development of their new free Society of Friends. Wetherill's trade card of 1776 introduces another important twist to the idea of inscription, the deliberate choice of iconography. On its front is depicted a single female figure dressed in a fancy gown seated on a ladder-backed chair spinning flax. Her wooden spinning wheel is like those most often found in homes and is powered by a manual foot treadle. A slogan flowing in a Rococo-style banner above her head reads, "Virtue and industry are the springs of happiness." Yet, while Wetherill did employ spinners to work out of their homes, his business was a factory. Symbolically, at least, a more forward-looking illustration might well have been this portrayal of America's first spinning jenny, brought to Philadelphia by the manufactory and depicted by arrangement of editor Tom Paine in the Pennsylvania Magazine of April 1775. The woodcut image is drawn in a stretched three-dimensional perspective used by draftsman inventor Tully to convey the fullest information about his jenny's specific construction. The various parts of the machine are marked with letters, which relate to descriptions of its workings provided in accompanying text. And note that while the jenny is threaded and ready for use, no person is shown actually turning its wheel. Historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich has explored the symbolism of the spinning wheel as a favored American icon for virtuous and productive domesticity, recounting, for example, an event staged in 1750s Boston where 300 girls carried their spinning wheels onto Boston Common to demonstrate their skills. The demonstration, Ulrich suggests, promoted the illusion that women at work could easily become self-sustaining. Other scholars have noted the apparent merging of artisan and manufacturer in both the public ethos and the political reality of the period. For example, in the way that the label homespun was applied to any woven fabric on native soil. Any fabric woven on native soil, whether made by hand at home or produced using automatic equipment in a factory setting. Domestic had a dual meaning, one historian explains, simultaneously connoting the household and the nation. Wetherill's own card clearly demonstrates this conflation, trading on visual sentimentality while also promoting an enterprise defined by its political and economic progressivism. In a speech at the Manufactory 3rd anniversary of March 1777, given at the height of their shared entrepreneurial success with as many as 400 women employed, Robert Strettle Jones stressed the critical need to encourage domestic cloth manufacture even in the midst of war. If America is to be wholly indebted to any foreign loom, we may be allowed to exclaim, adieu to the religion, farewell to the liberties of our country. In the present arduous conflict, let us prefer the coarsest, the most homely garb wrought from our native fleece to the finest, the most fantastic ornament that can be imported from the first fashion shops in Europe. Here are ideology and authenticity inscribed upon the very material of the native cloth itself, as effective mechanical reproduction is happily merged with the coarsest handmade garment in the name of the common good. Timothy Matlack, before he became a free Quaker, is thought to have engrossed the Declaration of Independence. That is, Matlack was probably the scribe who produced the iconic copy of the Declaration that was eventually signed by delegates in August of 1776. The atypical signing of the engrossed declaration after it had been printed complicates assurances of its authenticity in interesting ways. While we know that Matlack was employed as a clerk to assist Continental Congress Secretary Charles Thompson, there is no historical record of who engrossed the Declaration of Independence. The attribution to Matlack's hand is based on similarity of penmanship and originates in an article by a Library of Congress manuscript curator Gaylord Hunt in the Youth's Companion magazine of 1916. Probably there was not at that time, writes Hunt, a man in the country who was Matlack's equal as a penman. Hunt's attribution is offered on the basis of close visual comparison between the engrossed declaration and George Washington's commission as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, for which we do know that Matlack was a scribe. The two documents were formally mounted together in a single frame and displayed at the U.S. Patent Office that way in the 19th century. Another future free Quaker, Peter Thompson, was paid by the Continental Congress for, quote, engrossing on parchment the Act of Confederation in March of 1779. The 4-page document we know better as the Articles of Confederation had been engrossed by order and signed in Congress in the customary sequence. Like the engrossed Declaration of Independence, it too is considered a founding document worthy of display in the National Archives. Curiously, however, there has been next to nothing written about the engrossment of the Act of Confederation, nor is it easy for me to find any biographical information about Peter Thompson, conveyancer. Future free Quakers also signed money for Pennsylvania and for the Continental Congress. Congressional records show, for example, that Peter Thompson, along with future free Quaker Isaac Howell, was an inspector of the press for Continental bills of credit. In fact, Thompson's payment for service in engrossing also includes reimbursement for the red ink he used to sign money, and here instead is a piece signed in red by Isaac Howell. The popularity of the Declaration, paired with its atypical chronology of engrossment and signing after it was printed, has raised historical problems for skeptics while foregrounding issues of authenticity. Traditionally, an engrossed original was authenticated with signatures before the printing of the creation of printed copies, but the Declaration of Independence was immediately set to print and then only engrossed in late July or early August. Multiple printed copies of the Declaration preceded the single handwritten one, first through the distribution of the perhaps 200 originals printed by John Dunlap on July 4th and 5th, and then through its printed descendants that appeared in newspapers or as additional broadsheet reprints. Which of these, then, is the real Declaration? In an intriguing article titled Separated at Birth, Text and Context of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Starr further explores the relationship of printed to handwritten texts as applied to a comparison of the published and belatedly engrossed Declaration, historically and in modern imagination. At that time, Starr contends, the primacy of typography and printing is indicated by the prominence of Dunlap's name, Dunlap the printer, centered below Hancock's in the broadside, which I've tried to make a highlight for you. The printer's integral role in generating the final text caused him to take responsibility even before the members of Congress, whose names do not appear in the printed edition. The implications of this conceptual reversal are significant to the groundbreaking political meaning of the document. Quote, "The Dunlap printing bridged the conceptual distance between the colonists and the Congress by collapsing the physical distance between scattered communities in Philadelphia and connecting the work of the representatives to their constituents. The identical prints supported the principle of equality contained in the content. While with typographic printing, there was no place where hierarchy could reside. There was no difference between the document in the hands of the people and the one in the hands of those in the position of power." Starr, a graphic designer, then goes on to suggest that the typographic sameness of printed letter forms themselves serves to detach the text from the singularity of its authorship, creating a greater potential for collective identification with a declaration's important political message. Type is inherently plural and public, he asserts. Within typography's mission of equal accessibility through standardization, an important component was to convey an understanding to the reader that others were being identically informed. Yet, to counter Starr, I would ask, why do we then think of today and remember the engrossed declaration over the printed one? Is it simply because it is unique? By the 1770s, Quakers had survived a long history with print, having suffered a barrage of printed anti-Quakerania in 17th century England. Pennsylvania Friends argued bitterly among themselves via the print of the 1690s during a theological episode now known as the Keithian Schism, and the prosecution of Philadelphia's first printer for his role in publishing allegedly seditious work was an early test of freedom of the press in North America. But the next and most relevant round of print-related debates came about Pennsylvania Quakers, sparked by the events of the Paxton Riots, shown here in a satirical broadsheet of 1765. Already angered by lack of security on Pennsylvania's western frontier and directly enraged by the government's protection of innocent Moravian Indians when their own misplaced rampage posed the threat. I wrote myself a tongue twister. A group of frontiersmen from the town of Paxton near Harrisburg marched on Philadelphia. As rumor reached the city ahead of an approaching mob, Philadelphians rose to defend themselves. A significant number of Quakers took up arms in their own defense, contrary both to Quaker teachings and Quaker politics. And here you see the Market Street Meetinghouse filled with armed men, shown in the upper left. While outright confrontation was averted, an outpouring of pamphlet literature, mostly anonymous, quickly followed. Authors took up both sides of the controversy, ridiculing or defending the Paxtonians or the Quakers in turn. One scholar identifies 63 new pamphlets associated with the crisis, while a second points out that these pamphlets accounted for a fifth of Philadelphia's printed output for that year, which was in itself a 40% increase over the previous year's total. Historians have noted that this pamphlet war helped lay the groundwork for the foundational printed exchanges of the Revolution a decade later. Quakers participated in an extensive and regularized culture of manuscripts and of scribal publication, including the regular keeping of minutes of meetings for business, as well as issuing certificates of removal, requiring written testimonies from wrongdoing, setting down a discipline, creating shorthand transcriptions for extempore sermons, and producing multiple fair copies of many of the above. Use of print was selective and saved for documents of widespread distribution. The apparent involvement of disowned Quakers Timothy Matlack and Peter Thompson in the creation of engrossed founding documents at the moment of the flowering of print further magnifies the interrelationship of manuscript and print, not only among Americans of this era, but specifically within the practices of Friends, as well as the seeming adoption of, yet expansion upon, those practices by the Free Quaker group. Might a wide distribution of the printed Free Quaker broadsides to non-Quaker sympathizers have served as a form of sympathy-generating publicity? Working to actively inscribe a public narrative that drew with dialogic force on an emerging public print culture? Which brings us to narratives. I won't belabor my meta-discussion of narrative, except to say that It is probably more central to the writing of history than we sometimes consciously realize. History is essentially a story we tell ourselves about the past in order to keep making sense of the world around us in the present. One of the best challenges for anyone studying the past, and one of the central problems for the formal discipline of history in recent decades, has been to figure out which stories and which kinds of stories to tell in a rapidly changing world. How can we expand on our customary ways of researching and thinking through and writing about the past, getting beyond the great men and the well-known events, while still remaining compelling to our audiences? So, to return yet again to my two framing artifacts, I selected them as the most meaningful framing elements because of a certain narrative depth they provide. Each of these artifacts marks not only a moment when choices and actions were concretized in the world, but also a crucial moment of change that fundamentally anchors the trajectory of the Free Quaker story. Samuel Wetherill is by all accounts the founding spiritual founder of the group. As a designated minister among friends, he has been long engaged in the spiritual discussions that underlie Quaker practice, and he would serve to continue as clerk until all the way until 1808. Had he not chosen on spiritual grounds to affirm his allegiance to Pennsylvania in 1777, it is almost certain that the Free Quakers would not have been founded. In the date stone, I see a twofold significance. First, it marks the finished presence of the Meetinghouse, which concretizes so much about Quakerism and its surrounding culture in this revolutionary moment. And second, it declares for us the public motives of the Free Quaker Society at that very instant, literally carved in stone. They overtly tell us what they want us to know. Free Quakers, year of our Lord, of the Empire 8. During the decade of the 1790s, Samuel Wetherill published a series of religious tracts, the fourth and last of which was titled An Apology for the Religious Society Called Free Quakers in the city of Philadelphia, showing that all churches who excommunicate act inconsistently with the gospel of Jesus. In yet another artifactual inscription, here we see an original uncut copy, apparently Wetherill's own, also in the library's Carson Collection. Though it took him 15 additional years to write this, and it was a topic so evidently close to his heart, I would argue that the groundwork for this publication had already all but been laid by the time of the Meetinghouse's completion in 1783. Thus, in working to craft an argument through narrative, I choose to foreground the date stone as my endpoint, selecting its symbolic centrality rather than relying on some notion of a stricter chronology. In my research and in writing this presentation, I have been torn about how much time and attention to devote to the specific biographies of Samuel Wetherill on the left and Timothy Matlack at right, or to other Free Quakers of interest such as the brothers Clement and Owen Biddle, who worked with General George Washington at Valley Forge, the prolific diarist and radical Philadelphia committeeman Christopher Marshall, or flag maker Betsy Ross, the group's most celebrated female member. They are fascinating individuals who led compelling lives, and most of their life stories have yet to be told, with the important exception of Marla Miller's recent book, A Biography of Betsy Ross. As I have read their words over days, weeks, and months, I do begin to feel like I know them. To the extent that the Free Quaker story continues to be told at Independence Park, it is through biography as much as architecture. In fact, if during tourist season you visit the Free Quaker Meetinghouse today, you are likely to encounter an engaging costume performer posing as Samuel Wetherill Jr. or Timothy Matlack or occasionally Betsy Ross, ready to meet and greet you and answer questions about Philadelphia Quakers in general and the Free Quaker story in particular. People are charming, yet the downside of telling such person-based stories is that they tend to make the progressions of fate or happenstance seem planned and expected. After all, we already know how the story ends as we tell it. In biography, too, we've already pre-selected the most extraordinary lives. Thus, a second concern is that when you focus on one person, you inherently downplay the others, or may overlook the synergy of groups, two issues that I'll touch on again when we get to convergences. The bottom line is that I'm torn about narratives and their potential to distract as much as to organize. There are a couple of things I think you should know, though I see with my time running short, you're going to get a shortened version of those narratives today. Pennsylvania's capital, Philadelphia, was in the mid-1770s the largest city on the North American continent, having doubled in size in the previous 25 years, with a population of about 30,000 to 35,000. It was also in 1775 the largest British city outside of the British Isles. This map of 1784, which is the first to indicate the United States on a map, also goes so far as to indicate a second prime meridian at Philadelphia, to challenge that at Greenwich. Philadelphia was always planned as a city stretched between two rivers, with a grid that was laid out all together, some combination of founder William Penn's vision for a green country town that will never be burnt and always be wholesome, and surveyor Thomas Holmes' practical on-the-ground decisions about the winter and spring, made during the winter and spring of 1682 to 83. But despite Penn's wishes for a wholesomely spread out metropolis, early Pennsylvanians settled on the boundaries of the Delaware River. By the time of the American Revolution, the city was densely packed with multiple alleys slicing through the blocks of the city streets. This seemed to be missing a slide. The previous Paxton Riots you saw gave you a good indication of what the streetscape looked like, in that case, of course, full of political turmoil. Though Penn may have sought to found a Quaker haven in the New World, he also established religious liberty in Pennsylvania. There were a wide variety of German Anabaptists, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, Catholics, Jews, Presbyterians, and in this well-known view of Philadelphia, all the different kinds of houses of worship are highlighted. Out of order. There's the close view of the well-packed buildings. This is the background of Quaker Philadelphia, into which Samuel Wetherill Jr. and his brother-in-law Timothy Matlack came of age. Wetherill was born in 1736 of Quaker parents. He was raised as a carpenter, apprentice to Mordecai Yarnell, whose daughter he married. He became a surveyor for the Philadelphia Contribution Ship for the insurance of houses for loss by fire, and 4 years later founded the Friendship, or co-founded the Friendship Carpenters Company, which was an alternate carpenters company group in Philadelphia. He was also a devoutly religious Quaker, and as you know, in 1775, he joined the manufactory. Having changed his business from textiles, he then became a druggist and then launched his white lead business. He had strong religious convictions and maintained close ties with dissident Quakers through the rest of his life. In the 1790s, he published a number of religious pamphlets, and in 1800, he joined the Pennsylvania legislature as a Jeffersonian, engaged in the protracted negotiations over the new electoral college. Timothy Matlack, despite their commonalities, couldn't have been more different. Here we see him depicted by Charles Willson Peale, the famous painter. He was, like Wetherill, born in New Jersey, also married one of the Yarnell daughters. He was originally a hardware merchant, but unlike Wetherill, he was not disowned for any particular religious grounds, but rather for debt and neglecting coming to meeting. At the same time, his well-known successes at horse racing and cockfighting probably did not endear him to the Society of Friends. That took place in 1765, so the idea that he was somehow disowned for the Revolution is simply not true. Now, historians have long noted that the radical politicians who emerged in Philadelphia at the time of the Revolution were distinguished from earlier leaders because they were not part of an elite social class, and that certainly is the case for Matlack. I have a long list of all the different things that he did and where he served. I probably shouldn't take the time to read them, but he was the secretary of Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council, which is particularly important. Also, based on penmanship, he is attributed not only with the Declaration of Independence, but perhaps more important for our purposes, with drawing the unusual surviving pre-construction drawings of the Free Quaker Meetinghouse. In 1782, his fortunes changed, however, when he was accused of accounting irregularities related to his job with the council, and he was eventually jailed for that in 1787. As a font of diversely compelling iconography, he was a member of the Sons of St. Tammany. He personally evoked the production of satirical broadsides about him. He accompanied Charles Willson Peale on the unearthing of the mastodon, which was shown in this famous painting, and was also painted by Peale again at the end of both of their lives, actually, where he is shown wearing a liberty cap and holding a liberty pole. Then, convergences. So in my flyer for the talk today, I claimed that I would explore the convergence of social, economic, political, and religious factors that together shaped Philadelphia's Free Quakers as a movement and a community. One of those convergences, I've already noted, was the manufactory and the number of Free Quakers who later, let's put that the other way, the number of manufactory managers who later became Free Quakers when the society was formed in 1781. That came down to 4 managers and 4 subscribers who then would go on to become Free Quakers in 1781, and all of those are within the small group of about 15 Free Quakers who really formed the core of that community. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Oh, I'm getting behind myself. Here is a piece of money signed by 3 of those men. Now, a little slightly different kind of slide. Historians have a term which they call prosopagnosia for the study of collective biography, which is a method developed to help address some of the problems I raised earlier about individual biographical studies. As it turns out, the commonalities and collective associations among the Free Quakers extended well beyond the manufactory, telling together a rich story of lives interconnected on multiple planes, which I would suggest are 18th century social networks, thus Friendster and other familiar internet. Again, I have a long list that if I had more time, I would read all for you, but among them were memberships in the American Philosophical Society, business partnerships in manufacturing steel, people working together in the same professions, such as druggist and brewer, people signing money, the manufactory, of course, and as an interesting twist on those affinities, people being disowned by the Society of Friends for attending the Free Quaker meetings. A surprising number of the connections between Free Quaker founding members are also familial, and this is an experiment of mine in trying to show multiple generations and how they're interconnected. The older families are on the outside, the younger's moving in, and you see there are lots of husbands and wives intermarrying. I've been astonished to discover the amount of interconnection within this group, more than anyone has noticed and than I had ever expected. My other deep interest in convergences comes from my prior work on the meanings of the Quaker Meetinghouse among friends. The basis of Quaker theology, to the extent that there is one, is the concept of the inward light, the direct internal link of God's Spirit that is available to each person. Because of Quakerism's reliance on the ideal of individual religious inspiration, in practice, the relationship between behavior and intention was not always obvious and had to be, and could be misread. It had to be, therefore, negotiated in the world. Quakers would meet together in silence, wait for each other to be motivated to speak, and in hearing each other speak would then be able to negotiate what was God's common message. The situation is further complicated because Quaker theology leaves no room for the secular among those who are under the influence of God's word. all aspects of life are encompassed by the sacred once a proper understanding of the inward light is achieved. Thus, the meeting house becomes the place where the inner light and the outer world are negotiated together, and through various ways of behaving in the world, inner ideals are expressed in outward forms. Which brings us to the meeting house as a site of cultural negotiation. French philosopher Michel Foucault writes of a kind of space he calls heterotopia, capable of juxtaposing in a single view several places or sites that are in themselves incompatible. One way to think about the Quaker Meeting House and the Free Quaker Meeting House on a theoretical level is to understand it as the intersection of two concurrent, overlapping but not equivalent spaces. Since the meeting house is a site where belief becomes practice, where inward light becomes outer life. The fit between the ideal of the meeting house and the practices of what actually happened there can be messy. And this is where I see the most interesting point of convergence in the Quaker meeting houses, including here, the Free Quaker Meeting House. So, to finish up, a bit about the Free Quaker Meeting House itself. One of my still unanswered questions is why the drawings for the Quaker Meeting House were done by Timothy Matlack when it was Samuel Wetherill who had worked as a carpenter. I would guess it was because he was proud of his penmanship and that there was a growing interest in architecture as a gentlemanly pursuit in the 18th century, and think of Monticello as an example of that. This particular measured drawing is doubly rare, not only because any measured drawings from this time period were rare, but because it shows the interior of a Quaker meeting house, and it is the only one that I am aware of. You recognize that it is a Quaker meeting house immediately because of the raised facing bench where the ministers would sit. They were not professional ministers, but they were designated as people most likely to preach adequately during meeting, and it made sense to put them on a platform so it would be easier for them to be heard. Now, the reason for the creation of these drawings probably relates to the unusual circumstances under which the building came into existence. Recall that the Free Quakers made a claim against the Society of Friends for use of their meeting houses and then raised funds to build their own. The primary subscribers to their meeting house were not Quakers. They were the rest of the secular society, and it would have been important for the Quakers to authenticate and show what it was that they were going to build to their non-Quaker patrons. And an example to the heights to which this goes is the brick vaulted arches, which were planned in the basement, are here endorsed by clockmaker and astronomer David Rittenhouse, which is a flourish that concretely gestures to the visibly public nature of the plan to build the meeting house. Similarly, the Free Quakers went and took extensive notes on the sizes of what they considered other similar public buildings, which include Quaker meeting houses nearby and also the assembly room at Independence Hall. Now, it was in the second of their broadsides that the Free Quakers first made their claim against the Society of Friends, and from there launched another series of broadsides, some of them directed to Friends, some to the Assembly, some to the general public. I wish I had time to share, and I wrote this before I even realized I was taking a bit too long, but I wish I had time to share all the details of that amazing incident with you, because I love messy reality like that. But I thought what I'd go over very quickly is some of the printed aspects of that dispute. So after the Free Quakers requested that the Assembly pass a bill asserting their rights as person disowned to use of Friends' property and against the practice of Quaker disownment, that bill was immediately tabled. However, the regular Society of Friends felt compelled to respond. They wrote an address called a memorial and address on behalf of the people called Quakers to the Assembly. The Free Quakers turned around again and published a memorial and remonstrance in return, and then the regular Quakers printed their final remonstrance. Now, the end of the Free Quakers' last printing is what I do want to quote for you today. And let me skip ahead to where I get to this wonderful quote. In the closing of this missive, the Free Quaker memorialists called upon not only the people of Pennsylvania, but the states in union, the literati of Europe, and posterity to judge of their situation, hoping that through their actions we can have recourse to authentic records for our proof of having a claim of right to the property of friends. The Free Quaker Meetinghouse was completed in 1784. A second floor was added a few years later. It was open to the ceiling at first, and it was rented out as the group of worshiping friends became smaller over time. Before its restoration, it was moved to accommodate a widening of Fifth Street in Philadelphia, and it became part of Independence National Park. It is substantial but small for its size, and its exterior is unusually ornamented for a Quaker meeting house of its time, and here I highlight some of those ornamental details in the slide. In fact, other Quaker meeting houses of the era share some of the features of the Free Quaker Meeting House, but they don't have the same level of small ornamentation, and the Free Quaker Meeting House does not follow this sort of doubled plan that we think of as the iconic Quaker Meeting House. It's more like a small Quaker meeting house at Arnie's Mount. It does not, however, have an internal partition like this one, which was found in many Quaker meeting houses where they separated men and women during meetings for business. So the Free Quaker Meeting House had minimal interior furnishings. It also did not have a balcony, although for some reason I've yet to discover when they restored it, they added one where none had been. In fact, I think the Free Quaker Meeting House looks more like some of its neighboring churches in Philadelphia of the same time. You notice they're called pilaster columns, the rounded windows, the use of certain elements of framing on the gables. So I'm guessing that the Free Quakers went out of their way to show not only that they had a Quaker meeting house, but that they had a public building that was conversant with and similar to the other equivalent non-Quaker buildings in the Philadelphia community. This shows that they were on the edge of the city as well, in red, not near the other Free Quaker meetings. So finally then, I'll just finish with this quote by Quaker Samuel Wetherill from the same letter I started with at the beginning of my talk. "Either own me or disown me, you cannot disoblige me," he says. Now what I take from this quote is that as far as he's concerned, there's nothing the mainstream Society of Friends can do that will change his relationship with God. That relationship is with God, and all the trappings of Quakerism, the rules about which oaths or affirmations you can or can't take, how you could speak or dress, or how you could behave in the meeting house are all outward trappings, and the outside community of friends is not in a position to legislate that to him. Take this idea, move it outward to the Quaker meeting house itself, and then if I can find just my last paragraph, and I know Mary Lou is showing me the time, let me go forward there to the picture of the Free Quaker Meeting House. Actually, the Free Quaker Meeting House with the quote. Musing on the building's relationship to notions of Quaker plainness, architectural historian Jeffrey Cohen has suggested that its stylistic markers be understood not as a special treatment of a sacred building so much as the normative treatment of a well-mannered public architecture. I argue the belief is both central to the building's creation and visible in its fabric if we know what we're looking for. While Quakers drew a strong distinction between inner truth and outer world in their spiritual lives, living in the world is, in practice, an ongoing negotiation, always based in the specific ways that Quaker belief incorporates the secular back into itself. So too, the Free Quaker Meetinghouse negotiates its multiple influences from across the spheres of Quaker belief, Quaker practice, and everything that makes up non-Quaker culture at large. As Cohen so aptly puts it then, this building is indeed well-mannered public architecture and explicitly intended as such. It is also, however, and contrary to his assertion, exactly a special treatment of a sacred building. If there is no separation between the sacred and secular worlds, and if the trappings of the secular world are all that's available for communicating the sacred, then this meeting house fulfills its dual function remarkably well. It embodies messages about Quakerism and about the revolutionary world for the benefit of Quakers and non-Quakers alike. It slips seamlessly into its own time and place, and it literally concretizes a set of ideas and ideals drawn from what was a rapidly changing cultural, social, and political environment. With the revolution behind them, however, the Free Quakers were no longer relevant, and as a religious society, the group did not outlast its founding generation. Frozen in a moment of dissent made visible long gone, the Free Quaker Meetinghouse now stands only for itself, embodying a multiplicity of meanings that yet allow it to meet the meaningful needs of its successive generations. And with that, I will finally stop. So thank you very much.
She would take questions, so we're going to allow about 10 minutes for questions, and then I know there's going to be more than that, but we can continue those discussions later. Thanks.
I wonder if you'd be willing to
I think there's a microphone.
Yes. Would you be willing to comment on the possibility that the Free Quakers, being merchants, had an interest in getting closer to the Episcopalian community, were the rising part of society in Philadelphia at that time, and their movement was in a way political, or social and political as well?
Well, interestingly, and I didn't go into that as much as I could have, the Free Quakers were more on the artisan side of things and on the merchant side of things, and it was the mainstream Society of Friends, especially the leaders, who tended to be the wealthy merchants. So the Episcopalians or the Anglicans is a slightly harder to finesse issue than for the mainstream society. They definitely wanted, or we could argue, it's clear they wanted to maintain their merchant business transactions with England and with the British, which of course would have included Anglican connections. So one of the arguments that's often made is that the Society of Friends leaned towards being loyalist, particularly because they had so many strong business associations. I don't know so much about connections between the Anglicans and the Free Quakers specifically. I haven't seen a lot of that. I have seen some interesting connections with some alternative other religious groups. For example, there were some Universalist Baptists in Philadelphia that some Free Quakers were very close with. There was another schismatic Quaker group, followers of the Universal Friend, who they were also close with. So not so much the mainstream Anglicans that I've seen. Am I supposed to be the one calling on people?
Susan, I had a question. It's on. I'm curious whether the Free Quakers that were closely tied with the revolutionaries, the other revolutionaries at the time, fared better in the second generation than those who did not. Do you have any sense about that from your research? Fared better economically and politically?
I think what you're asking is those who, maybe you can expand a little, fared better, the second generation being the children of Free Quakers who grew up in the community?
Did the Free Quakers and their children fare better economically in the new nation than those who did not
okay. I see what you're
support the
saying.
revolution overtly?
I see what you're saying, okay. It's certainly the case that for specific mainstream Quakers who had been wealthy, who supported the British or appeared to support the British, that they individually had trouble. They lost their estates, they lost land, they were property was taken from them in lieu of taxes. So for some individuals it was a problem, but I don't have a strong sense that for the Society of Friends as a whole versus the Free Quakers as a whole, there was any particularly different trend. And it's kind of funny with the Free Quakers. I have a lot of information about some people like Wetherill and Matlack, and not so much information about others. So Samuel Wetherill's family did remarkably well. Branches of the Matlack family did quite well, although not necessarily his own immediate children so much. Other Free Quakers, I can't tell at this point what happened to their families because I have to do this painstaking kind of, there are no letters to read. I have to go through and try and I haven't gone that far into the successive generations.
Is this on?
No.
No.
Well, what's interesting in that regard is when, for example, the Christopher Marshall, who kept a very detailed diary, it's pretty clear that when the Free Quaker Meetinghouse first opened for worship, many non-Quakers who were sympathetic came to share worship with the Free Quakers. They didn't become members, however, and a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, they were no longer participating to the same extent. So I would argue that between the broadsides and the presence of the Meetinghouse, there was certainly a public message. The other thing was that there was a very close conversation between the Free Quakers and a group of Quakers of similar leanings in Massachusetts, and they continued to maintain ties. I've found evidence of a certain person living in New Jersey or living in Western Pennsylvania who maintained strong ties with the group. So I can only imagine that it's some combination of that public message and then making of personal contacts. So I hope that's the case, and I'm going to continue to look for additional evidence. One other thing, some of these missives on both sides, I found them reprinted in newspapers in England and in Europe. So the literati of Europe are actually seeing some of this stuff. So that also suggests that it is the case. There's a question way in the back.
I had a personal interest in coming today since my parents chose to name me after one of the Quakers in Philadelphia, Mrs. Jenkins. Her husband, Charles Jenkins, was head of the Pennsylvania Historical Society for many, many years. I wondered if you had an opportunity to look at the many books that we have here in the collection of his.
I actually haven't worked with him specifically. I will say, though, that the Historical Society of Pennsylvania is, for someone working on Philadelphia, maybe even a little bit more amazing than the Library of Congress's manuscript division, but having the Carson Collection here really does rival it. It is an astonishing, Quakers really saved things. Philadelphians influenced by Quakers really saved things. And if you are interested in Philadelphia, make your way to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. That I certainly can say.
Even today, Philadelphia plays up its Quaker roots, calls itself the Quaker City. Penn's sports teams are the Quakers. If you went there in this period that you're talking about, would you have sensed that they sort of set the tone of the city? Would you have sensed that yes, it's a Quaker city?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of visitors, commenters at the time, the Marquis de Chastellot or people like that, would comment on Philadelphia and call it Quaker Plain. Now, whether it was particularly plain is not necessarily clear, but it was distinctive because of two things. One, that it was gridded, and so all the streets were in regular lines, and so the houses were lined up very nice and neatly, not what you saw in London, not what you saw in Boston. And the other thing is that the buildings were almost exclusively made of brick, and that was because William Penn had survived the Great London Fire of 1666, and he legislated that there would be no frame or wooden buildings in his city. There wasn't a lot of stone available, so brick became the building material of choice, and between the straight lines of the streets and the rows and rows of similar looking brick houses, which honestly are pretty much sort of middle class looking for any place where they built in brick at this time, but it still gave the appearance of, and people commented that it seemed to be Quaker. And there's some really, if you're interested, I can tell you some books to go look at that try to think more about what was distinctive about Philadelphia. Is that a good stopping point?
It's just about 10 minutes right here, so thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.